La cafetière à piston, or the French press as it's known in other parts of the world, is one of the most common brewing methods out there. It's a brewing method that many people love and also one that many people can't stand. I sometimes hear people say that it's a very easy and forgiving method, and I don't find that to be the case at all. When I first got into coffee, I really struggled with the French press, and actually it was so much I completely gave up on the brewing method for several years. So today I will share 5 big mistakes that I have personally made with the French press and that I know are also quite common out there. And of course I'll also teach you how to fix these issues. So mistake number 1 is using the wrong ratio of coffee to water. This is so incredibly common. I even see a lot of coffee professionals getting this wrong. And I can understand why, because it's actually quite counterintuitive and difficult to understand. The short version is that French press is actually not as efficient a brewing method as drip coffee. So you need to make French press a good deal stronger than you would with drip coffee. You've probably heard about the golden ratio for coffee, and that's a certain perfect ratio of coffee to water. Some people will say it's 1:17 to 1:18, but this is actually a misunderstanding. The main research about this was made in 1957 by Professor Ernst Lockhart. And his main suggestion is actually not that you need to use a special golden ratio. Instead, he observed that there is a target range for strength and for extraction percentage. So why is this important? Well, the way you calculate the extraction percentage is actually not the same for drip coffee and French press. Now, this is all very geeky and complicated, but the key thing that you need to know is that a good ratio for French press is usually 1:14 to 1:15, or we could also say around 66 to 70 grams of coffee to a liter of water. Mistake number 2 is working against the crust. So what do I mean by that? Well, when you brew French press, the coffee will naturally float to the top and form a crust. Many people believe that the crust is a problem and that they'll need to stir it up before plunging. But what happens if you do that is actually that you energize a lot of the small fines, the small particles in the brew, and that means that they will have an easier time getting past the plunger and into your cup. When coffee forms the crust, an interesting thing happens, and that is that the smallest particles fall to the bottom because they release all the CO2 right away and they can get completely wet, while the bigger particles, they still have some gas inside and they are more porous, so naturally they will float for a long time. So in a way the coffee is actually filtering itself with small particles in the bottom and bigger as you get closer to the surface. You want to work with this and not against it. If you plunge directly onto the crust will itself act as a kind of filter that will protect your brew against these super small particles that you definitely don't want to get into your cup. But there is a problem, because you also do need to stir the French press. You do want to have some agitation to get a really consistent extraction. So the solution I suggest is stirring with a spoon after you put in half the water. Just do a quick north, south, east, west, and then you can get all the grounds mixed up. Then you add the rest of the water and you will still get a nice crust, and you'll have the benefit of agitation at the same time. Another mistake is skimming or not skimming. I know it sounds a bit complicated, so let me just explain. You probably already know James Hoffmann, and if you don't, he's the most influential coffee person in the solar system. And for that reason, his French press recipe is incredibly popular. In that recipe, he calls for breaking the crust and skimming the surface. Skimming the surface is actually something that is done in coffee cupping, and it's best practice. It definitely makes your first sips cleaner. But if you follow the Hoffmann method, then you have to follow it completely. You can't just skim the surface and then pour the coffee. You need to wait the 5 minutes that the method calls for and let all the grounds settle at the bottom. So it's correct, if you're following the Hoffmann technique, the recipe, then the crust doesn't matter and you need to follow his recipe completely. On the other hand, if you don't follow his technique, then you do need the crust to help filter the brew. The next big mistake is that you're probably grinding too coarse, and this is a very persistent myth about the French press, that you have to grind super coarse. Otherwise, if you grind finer, then the small grounds are going to make it into the cup. This is again very unfortunate, because if you're brewing at a 2-week ratio, which many people do with a very coarse grind size, then you most likely end up with a pretty weak and under-extracted cup. and it will taste kind of muddy at the same time. And that dirty feeling will cheat your brain to think that the coffee is not under-extracted, so it will be hard to diagnose the problem. The idea that French press should have a coarse grind size is probably because people want to avoid getting grounds into the coffee. But if you look at the plungers of any of these brewers here, then you can easily see that a common medium grind size shouldn't be a problem, and actually it should be able to filter out those particles. The problem is more that whenever you grind coffee, you will have a lot of fines, and these small fines can easily go through the mesh, and that means that you have to be really careful about getting those into your cup. But this is much more related to other things than grind size. For instance, do you agitate the brew when you plunge? Do you pour too aggressively? And so on. So all this is to say that you can and should grind finer than you expect. Whether the coffee is silty or dirty is up to something else. Another common mistake is not decanting the brew. Decanting the French press, pouring it over into some carafe, is one of the most beneficial things you can do for your brews, but still it's something I only see coffee geeks do. There are several good reasons to decant into a separate carafe. First of all, you'll get the coffee down to drinking temperature a lot faster. French press is just way too hot to drink if you serve it directly. Second, it gives you an additional step to get rid of silt if you pour gently. And third, it mixes together the brew. If you just pour French press cup by cup, then there will be a pretty big difference in strength between the first cups you pour and the last ones. And finally, it stops the brew at the right time when the extraction is exactly right. So these are the 5 most common mistakes I see with a French press. If you can get this right, then you'll be making a pretty good cup of coffee. But if you want to take your French press from just good to really, really delicious, then there is a special way to do that. It's a technique that is pretty unknown, but for me it produces the best French press that is possible. Actually, I did a video on this technique recently, so if you're interested, then click this video right here, and then I'll see you over in that video.